Good morning, everybody. The title of my talk is We Are All Walking Home Together. And in Wajiri, in my sort of status as a beginner speaker, that would sound something like Nanu Waranai Mana Nurigi. And it's a shared story and more than black and white, because life is complicated, isn't it? And I think some of that richness is already displayed to us by this beautiful image from Nellie Green under the Milky Way. And we can see it as looking up at the stars, but we can also see it as a kind of a map of relatedness and a connection to each other and to the country. And that's one of the ways I'm going to think about it today. I too wanted to pay my respects to the elders, past, present and emerging of the Gadigal and Darug land on which I work, and to those peoples where you might be listening from, and to the Yamachi people of WA who are referenced today. We are in land that has never been ceded, and despite the stories of loss and trauma, I think, or I see it, that we are now here to heal trauma lines and sing country and people into new song lines, as the dreaming suggests to us. And one of the wonderful kind of thinkers in that Australian healing process is the psychiatrist Helen Milroy, who for some time has been helping us understand how to connect, with an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander view of the world. And she says we are part of the dreaming. We have been in the dreaming for a long time, before we are born on this earth, and we will return to this vast landscape at the end of our days. It provides for us, during our time on earth, a place to heal, restore, purpose and hope, and to continue our destiny. And I remember hearing about this from Helen, and I had at that stage a very deeply Christian understanding, and I suppose I thought of that eternal connectedness in that way. But now, with the greater understanding of my likely Aboriginality, it means something different again. And in reality, and I'll share an incident about that, it has a very real and lived feeling for me. This talk is going to offer a very, very personal journey of adaptation and healing. It's still incomplete, as you will undoubtedly work out if you have your ears open, as I seek to integrate two parts of my heritage, coming from a rural Australian Celtic Irish stock from near the Snowy Mountains in New South Wales, and then urban Sydney and a long hidden stolen story of an Aboriginal heritage linking to Yamachi country in the WA. I currently identify as of a mixed identity, including as a Wajiri woman living on Gadigal land and working on Gadigal and Darug land. I need that salt water at Clovelly and nearby for health, sane, otherwise known as sanity. But I do feel that disconnection from country and the larger kin of my origins. To me, the community of saints from my Catholic spiritual immersion and the ancestors are in conversation. It is real to me, and I acutely feel the legacy of the stolen laws. To understand illness and health, my own experience has been that we really need to discern relational life at every level of connection. We've got to discern the body corporate, and the feelings of that connectivity within and between. So in some ways, there are tales in this of a people torn apart, persons torn apart. This journey to reconnect is not unusual, very sadly, in Australia, which has been torn apart by forces of colonisation and the downstream policies of assimilation. Yet Atsi people have resisted these forces with enormous creative resilience, as have the Celtic peoples of Ireland, Scotland and Wales, and First Nations peoples throughout the world. As a psychiatrist, psychotherapist, teacher and researcher, a woman of spirit and music, a wife and a mother, a colleague and friend, I speak to attachment, separation, loss, trauma and adaptation from many angles. There are other parts of my story that I share with others with deep roots of trauma that I am grappling with. A child of two parents with mental illness, a carer, a woman with her own disability and with a mounting set of losses. And it is much more. than a black and white story. Selving is a lifelong journey beginning in the seemingly distant lives of our ancestors and in spirit, Atman, Logos, shaping the way we form in the milieu of the womb, the eternal ocean, the formless void, and the world, country, east of Eden, and in our early and later relatedness. This talk will offer a very personal story of attachment, loss, trauma, adaptation, and healing still incomplete as I seek to integrate those two parts of my heritage. The Aboriginal side nurtures me through the dreaming, bringing me back to that same ineffable, incandescent place that I have often sat in wonder. With good companions, I've circled back many times to the crossroads, feeling that we are all walking home together. I hope to speak to you from the heart about that journey home in words and song. So I do hope you've got headphones on or you've got the capacity to have them, because you'll get more out of this probably if you do, because music being what it is, it does need that more refined set of access to frequencies if you can do it. And I'm hoping there's an encouragement for us to really listen deeply together this morning. And I really ask for your listening spirit and heart and mind to be turned on, as well as your ears and headphones as needed. We're going to begin with having a real think about the sort of background story. And there's a beautiful word in Wajri, Nangurmana, which means listening, hearing, thinking, remembering. And I think a psychotherapist is so beautiful that so much is wrapped up in that term. I ask your patience and a little of that beautiful verb, Nangurmana. I grew up in southwest Sydney in a housing commission, government housing street. It really was quite a dangerous place. I was the child of two parents with mental illness. My mother had a PTSD from witnessing her first husband die of extensive electrical burns. My father had schizophrenia, likely triggered by trauma and loss. From this simple sentence, you can already see it is not so surprising that I have become a consultation liaison psychiatrist and psychotherapist, perhaps as a form of adaptation. However, it is also the notion of attachments that are protective and adaptations that are creative that are important to me. My parents were complex, gifted people that, despite significant loss, trauma and hardship, had values and lives of love and service to others. Both have been trained as teachers and in their own way created communities around themselves. My dad had begun medicine, but his mental health broke down at university, and instead he became a maths teacher, although he couldn't work in schools for much of his life and spent much of it when he could work tutoring individual children through a very strong and powerful dedication to a remedial approach to mathematics. My mother was a special needs teacher, initially to the hearing impaired, and then to those with intellectual disability for a very long time, and then finally ran a local public preschool filled with immigrant and refugee children. This was a Whitlam-era initiative to bridge the way to infant school for the child and for their family. My mother's enjoyment of cultural difference and conversation and food and her capacity for welcome was crucial to the success in building a joyous and lively multicultural preschool community. I do believe a lot of healing went on for some of those families who'd come from particularly war-torn and difficult settings. My earliest personal memory is vague but warm, of sitting in a high chair in the sunroom with my maternal grandmother nearby. Her name was Lucy, meaning light. She was the source of much light for us. It came often in the form of practical care, but it was infused with a warmth and that light of positive regard. She didn't say much due to her quiet nature, but her company in the rhythms of the day, and her cups of tea were filled with her love. And she was an excellent, if often wordless listener and a good companion. Her strong, actually, it was incredibly contemplative faith, actually, in God was a key part of her and something I think she fostered and nurtured in me. However, her own story was challenging and probably accounted for some of her quietness. She'd been born to a large family at the foothills of the Snowy Mountains and was given to her maternal aunt at around 12 when that woman had experienced multiple miscarriages. Unfortunately, her aunt also had depression, and my grandmother likely experienced both the rejection from her own otherwise loving family and her mother's her foster mother's disorganizing depression. It left her definitely underlyingly quite anxious. With hindsight, she likely struggled with my mother's birth, her first girl child, and they were not a good match of temperament, as my mother had a wild and emotional streak that did not sit easy with Nana. She kind of had a more natural connection with my aunt who followed. She, however, found solace her whole life in that deep meditative spirituality that I've spoken about, and in her very warm actual relationship with my maternal grandfather. Together, despite the challenges to their early stability, and he had some too, they built a life and a home that welcomed and nurtured others, including me and my family. The fate of babies is a very big part of my story and my kind of way of seeing the world, as it is, of course, for many people. My own upbringing was supported by Nana Lucy and Papa, those maternal grandparents, and that rural raising for them had given them values of earth and family and friends gathering around a table and in conversation. Papa chased Lucy to Sydney, actually, where they married and settled. He was a little bit younger than her, but he'd always fancied her, and so he came after her when she left, which was very fortunate for the rest of us. He himself was the son of a woman known in her community as a baby thriver, someone caring for infants when mothers were sick or had died so that the baby could survive. Papa was originally a farm boy, but he learnt tracking and bushcraft from local Aboriginal people who had befriended him. As my great-grandfather had been blinded in a mining accident, my grandfather's trapping of rabbits for meat to eat and skins to sell, sometimes kangaroo, was an essential part of the household economy. Our family story at that stage of support between white and black cultures on that side was strong. Fragments of Erse, Irish Gaelic, was still spoken by my great-grandmother, and the phrase "Macushla Macree, beat of my heart," was in my mother's ears, and she shared it with me to be shared with my daughter in time. Can you hear?
We can now.
Rest easy, my baby. Rest easy and be at peace, for I am with thee. Sleep easy, my baby. Sleep easy and be at peace, for I am with thee. A beat of my heart beating free. Makushla, Makushla, Makri. Rest easy, my baby. Rest easy and be at peace, for I am with thee. Sleep easy, my baby. Sleep easy and be at peace, for I am with thee. Beat of my heart beats for thee. Oh, fly on, my spirit, sprout wings and be free. When all of my yearning returns to the sea, I know I shall look up, and there I shall see the child of my spirit returning to me. Oh, Makushla, 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 Makri. Beat of my heart beats for thee. Oh, fly on, blessed spirit, sprout wings and be free. When all of my yearning returns to the sea, I know I shall look up, and there I shall see the child of my spirit returning to me. Oh, Makushla, Makushla,
This is a beautiful shot that I love of the ocean at Clovelly, and this is obviously a rather wild and woolly and windswept shot of it. But this place is very important to me, and actually was very important to my dad. My father's schizophrenia unfortunately brought separation into our life and the family story very early. The illness made the challenges of parenting too stressful, and he left our family home when I was a toddler and before the birth of my younger sister. My mum was only just pregnant. In fact, I'm not even sure that Dad even knew that at the time he walked out the door. So that's kind of a bland and factual statement, but it covers a lot of tragedy. He left without notice, heading, as it turns out, back to WA, leaving my mother not knowing, actually at that time, if he had committed suicide or simply vanished. Initially, the relatives in WA did not confirm that he had returned there, so there was a terrible anxiety and unknown sense. I must think a strange atmosphere would have prevailed for some time. However, as said, my grandparents stepped in to support in many ways where they could. My own memories of preschool days are of becoming a translator for my younger sister, who is unoriginal in so many ways, and she spoke her own language for the first 4 years of her life. So in a way, this picture images one of her beautiful words, which was bio, and it too the ocean has been an ongoing part of my story. We were so often touched because my mum had a mad keen interest in Latin, actually, and in language. And of course, the word for life is bio, and this was the word for water that Naomi came up and that we used for some time. I remember playing with Naomi during the day spent at home with Nana in attendance while Mum worked. This was a single mum and she had to. We would await Mum's return, and I did love the times of being read to at night by her. She was an absolute committed reader, and she herself too was a great original, and she was ahead of her time in her love for and her anxiety, actually, about the environment and her deep interest in things like fantasy and science fiction. She also loved poetry. And in fact, to be honest, she would have read the back of the tomato sauce bottle if that was all that was at hand. There was a little bit of competition needed to get her attention if there was anything in print in her view. When Star Trek came out, she loved it. And there was a sense of kind of wicked license of being allowed to stay up to watch it with her. And some of my first remembered nightmares, to be frank, are about some of the scariest scenes in some of those Saturday night Star Trek episodes. She was a fierce and probably necessary protector in our dangerous street, but she spoke of a loving God. I often wonder if, in fact, she was a bit of a pagan. But nevertheless, she spoke about this loving God, and she offered welcome to many in our strange community of misfits. She could be angry in a way that was, without doubt, terrifying. It was complicated, as was she. But she knew enough to stay at certain times when she was needed, something that, in a kind of a non-linear way, I realised over time as I thought about things. And so this is one of those poems of Titus Media that I wrote about that sort of sense of separation from Dad, and then what ensued in the family. And for me, and I got very unwell, I had pneumonia before the age of 2, or around the age of 2. It reminds me of the ache in my hidden ear when you left my father and we were all distempered, angry, swollen, anguished, and I not yet 2, buried in my throat and my head, hot and heavy with a scream of pain-filled nights and the madness of fever frightening my mother and strangely freeing me. I don't want to hear, I don't want to know. Stop, little fishy, stop biting my toes. But if you stop, then I will remember the silence and the sea, and I will truly drown. Sit down, I tell her in delirium. And for once in all those years, she listens and obeys the command and stays with me in my madness, which I, of course, forget. Still she, surprised, remembers and reminds us both when I can hear the gift she does not understand. But I, thirsty, drink it down and am greedy and glad. Oh, so many years ago, this water of life I waited for, hidden in the face-painted rock. But there, where I knew it should be, had stayed sweet till struck. She stayed with me. She stayed with me. That's good enough. Good enough for 100 summers and many a long and wintry night. All my life, the story of my father's university breakdown was the bigger part, or the bigger story, or part of the bigger history for me. My mother knew he had suffered in Castledale Orphanage, having been surrendered, along with his younger brother, by my paternal grandmother after separation from her alcohol-abusing and violent husband. There was always a sense that we did not know the whole story, and my mother often wondered quietly herself if Dad had an Aboriginal ancestry through my grandmother, but did not share this with me till much later. He and my uncle were abused in the Christian Brothers boarding system, and Dad, a fine scholar and sportsman, likely had his first prodromal psychotic symptoms at 16, describing how hard it began to be to concentrate on his study. The background to this whole surrendering and separation is the stolen law environment of WA in the early 20th century. with removals going on for decades and forced surrenderings. Since childhood, I have found the Coventry Carol haunting and disturbing, telling the story of the slaying of innocents. This piece I'm about to play is part of a work of mine that brings together the Northern Hemisphere Christmas and the Southern Hemisphere story of the stolen land and stolen families and children. This one takes the Coventry Carol and sets it for music box, bells and chimes and renders it electronically and manipulates it. This aims to offer a sense of the collision of cultures and the fear, disorientation and dislocation of our Indigenous owners when home was colonised and children lost or taken in this huge land of desert and stars. The audio sample of a PVC didgeridoo in C is used with permission for this sort of teaching purposes, not commercial, and it comes from the Dig shop, and I'm very grateful to them.